The second interview of Dr. Jamisson Neruda. By Sarah.
What follows is a session I recorded of Dr. Neruda on December 28, 1997. He gave permission for me to record his answers to my questions. This is the transcript of that session. This was one of 5 times I was able to tape record our conversations. I have preserved these transcripts precisely as they occurred. No editing was performed, and I've tried my best to include the exact words, phrasing, and grammar used by Dr. Neruda. It's recommended that you read the December 27, 1997, interview before reading this one. Before we begin tonight's session, I wanted to tell you that I've listened to last night's tape and have used it to formulate some new questions. I noticed that I was all over the place with regard to my questions, and tonight I'm going to try and stay more focused. So I'm just warning you that if I get off track again, remind me to stay on course, okay?
I'll certainly do my best. Although I'm not sure what your course is.
Well, I guess I'd like to stay more centered on the Wingmakers and the artifacts of their time capsule.
That's fine with me. But let me make one clarification first. The ancient Arrow site was labeled initially as an extraterrestrial time capsule, or ETC. However, it is not actually, in my opinion, a time capsule.
Good, let's start right there. What exactly is it, in your opinion?
The site is part of a larger structure that's interconnected through some means I don't understand. We know there were 7 sites that have been constructed on Earth presumably in the 9th century. We know that these sites have some defensive purpose, and we know that the site's planners represent themselves as culture bearers, and are most likely representatives from the Central race.
I hear a lot about defensive weapon, but how can these wall paintings or the music artifacts be considered part of a defensive weapon?
We know from our RV sessions that the Wingmakers designed these sites to be more than a defensive weapon, otherwise, as you point out, the cultural artifacts wouldn't make any sense. However, it also doesn't make sense that they'd be completely unrelated to the objectives of a defensive weapon. I'd make the hypothesis that they're DNA triggers.
You mean they activate something within our DNA? As you were describing last night?
Correct.
And how does this relate to a defensive weapon?
It was our hypothesis that the cultural artifacts, if studied or examined, would somehow activate parts of our DNA. For what purpose we weren't certain, but I intuit that it has something to do with stimulating our fluid intelligence and enabling sensory inputs that have been dormant within our central nervous system.
And do you have a hypothesis as to why?
Presumably the enhancements to the central nervous system makes the defensive weapon more effective.
It's so damn easy to get sidetracked when talking with you. But I'm going to resist the temptation to move into a line of neurological discourse, not that I know anything about it anyway. Tell me more about your role with the Wingmakers time capsule. Or whatever you want to call it.
I think for accuracy and consistency, we can refer to it as the ancient Arrow site. As I said before, I'm confident that it's not a time capsule. To your question, though, I was working with a computer we call Zemi, helping to translate the data contained on the optical disc found in the 23rd chamber of the site. It contained text, symbol pictures, mathematical equations, and what turned out to be music files. Once the site was located, my primary focus was to decode the optical disc and make the data therein sensible and, as much as possible, applicable to BST.
Did any of it apply to BST?
Not directly, at least nothing that I've read. The text was of a more philosophical nature. I was the first one to read their language. Once we unlocked the optical disc, we printed out 8,045 pages of symbol pictures like the ones contained in their artwork, except much more varied, and, in some instances, much more complex. There were 23 chapters of text or symbol pictures each consisting of about 350 pages. I read the first segment or chapter of this text and was amazed to find that there were passages of text in the introduction that were only readable to me. This was additional confirmation that I had a role to play in getting this information into the public domain.
Are you saying that the text you read disappeared after you read it or that you deleted it?
It disappeared. It deleted itself.
So only the first eyes would see the message?
Correct.
So what did it say?
I can recite the exact words if you like, but it would take a few minutes.
Give me a summary.
The essence of this passage was validating what the ACO had already known, that the Animus were sending probes in 2011, and it was written in the form of a warning. It stated that the Wingmakers had installed a defensive weapon on Earth that would render the planet invisible to the Animus probes.
Invisible? How?
They didn't explain with any precision. They wrote that higher frequencies were emanating from the central universe, and that these 7 sites comprised a collective technology that somehow coordinated these frequencies or higher energies to bring about a shift in the planet's vibratory structure, enabling life on the planet to survive the shift and remain undetected by the Animus.
All life forms?
Technically, the text didn't specify.
And this was for your eyes only?
Yes, the Zemi operator did not find any evidence of this section of the text. It completely disappeared.
What else did it say?
It confirmed that we are dealing with the Central race, and that they want the cultural artifacts from the 7 sites to be shared with the public. These elements were connected to the effectiveness of the defensive weapon.
In what way?
In the sense that the materials activate aspects of our DNA that make the shift easier, or perhaps possible. I'm not certain because they were a bit vague.
So, by reading the philosophy I'm supposed to be able to become invisible?
I think it's more holistic than that. They left behind poetry, music, paintings, and even a glossary. It seems to me that all of these elements in addition to the philosophy are connected. Also, I'm suggesting that something fundamentally changes when these materials are absorbed, and perhaps this change, whatever it is, resonates with the technology from the 7 sites.
Sounds far-fetched to me. Why do you believe this?
I've absorbed the materials and I've noticed changes.
Such as?
I defected from the ACO. To me, that's the biggest change imaginable.
You're not implying that the materials you've read induced you to defect, are you?
It was a combination of many things, but it certainly had a significant impact on my decision. Did you read any of the materials I left last night?
I read the first section and a little of the glossary. I didn't understand it. It was too abstract. It did have an effect on me though. It managed to put me to sleep.
I know it's a little intense, but you have to admit, it's very interesting if for no other reason than they're representative of how our distant ancestors think and believe.
And you have a copy of all the pages of text?
Yes.
And can I see it?
Yes, but it's not something I carry around with me.
Tell me a little bit about the translation process since you were involved in it.
The translation is the key to the usefulness of the optical disc, and using a carefully sequenced set of experiments, conducted by Zemi, we were able to access the disk's data files in 5 days.
How do you know that the translation is accurate?
Within the disk, once it was accessed, were translation indexes that enabled their text to print out in perfect English, or about 60 other languages. It took us 2 days to figure out how to access the disk, but once we did, we were able to access the 24 sections of text in the span of 17 hours. The most vexing of the translations, and the one in which we have the least confidence, is the music.
Good. I'm glad you brought up the music because I don't understand that element of the time capsule.
How do you mean that?
Was the music already on the optical disc, and you simply captured it from the disc? Or was it basically produced by the Labyrinth group based on the musical notations?
Actually, it was a bit of a combination of the two. Their musical notations were very precise and they left digital samples of each of their instruments, even vocals. So we simply translated their digital samples to a MIDI standard and produced our own version of their music.
So were you involved in the music translations as well?
Yes. I helped in the initial discovery of their musical notation and helped with the translation indexes. I wasn't involved in its production phase, though I was very curious as to what it would sound like.
Can I hear any of these compositions?
Yes, of course. When I left, the ACO had successfully translated 10 of the 23 music compositions. I have these. And they've been converted to both CD and cassette standards. I also have complete files of the remaining 13 compositions in their raw, deconstructed form.
How were they produced exactly?
Do you mean that technically or artistically?
I guess both.
On the technical end, We needed to step their samples down to a resolution of 384-bit in order to use them in our computer systems. When we first heard the samples of instrumentation, we were somewhat relieved to hear familiar sounds. There were some that were different, but for the most part, the digital samples that were encoded on the optical disc were the same as contemporary musical instruments heard around the world. Once we had captured their samples and organized them into octaves, we took their compositional notations and essentially let the computer select the digital instrumentation based on their samples. Eventually this all had to be stepped down to a 24-bit commercial CD mastering system, which was then pressed on a CD and recorded onto a cassette tape. As for the artistic production, there really wasn't much that we did. The computers did all the interpretative work and essentially performed the production for that matter. We had some of our staff perform overdubs on various versions to experiment with the compositions. The music was very popular, particularly when you listened to it at a sampling resolution of 384-bit.
Didn't anyone wonder why the time capsule included a musical construction kit instead of just having a recording of the music? I mean, why have us bring an artistic interpretation to their music?
Everything was wondered about in the Ancient Arrow project. Everything. We didn't know why they did it the way they did it, but again our hypothesis was that the Wingmakers didn't have a way to bring their music into our world because we lacked the technology to listen to it. So they disassembled their music into, as you put it, a construction kit, which enabled us to reconstruct the music so it could be listened to on our technology. It's the most logical reason. There were several of us who were able to experience Chambers 1 and 2 as a completely integrated form of expression, and it was a very powerful experience, to say the least. When you hear the music in 384-bit resolution with the original paintings, standing inside the actual chamber in which they were placed, it is a very moving and spiritual experience. Unlike any I've ever had.
In what way?
Just that the sense of being pulled out of your body and into the portal of the painting is irresistible. There is a very strong sense of movement into and beyond these paintings, and the music and paintings are only two of the art forms. The third, the poetry, is also part of the experience.
So tell me about the poetry.
The poems are expressive of a wide range of subjects. To most of us at the ACO, they could have been written by any contemporary poet. There was really nothing that caused them to stand out as representing a culture billions of years older than our own. Many of the same themes about spirituality, love, relationships, and death were evident in their poems as well. There were actually 2 poems for each chamber painting, so there's a total of 46 poems.
That's interesting. Everything else, the paintings, music, artifacts, and philosophy, is placed 1 per chamber. Why do you suppose they've placed 2 poems in each chamber instead of 1?
In my opinion, it was to provide a broader perspective into the particular theme represented by a specific chamber. The poetry appears to be designed in such a way to provide both a personal and universal perspective in each of the chambers. But again, it's just a working hypothesis at this time.
I assume from the examples you left me, that the poetry is also a bit less abstract when compared to their philosophy and paintings. Have you considered how the poetry is related to the paintings?
Yes. And I believe the poetry and the paintings have the strongest connection of all the objects in each of the chambers. I think the paintings illustrate in some subtle way the themes represented in the poetry. In some instances, when the painting represents an assemblage of abstract objects, the poetry is also more abstract. When the painting is more illustrative, the poetry seems more like prose.
Are you saying then that the poetry carries the central meaning of each chamber?
I'm not sure, but it does seem that the poetry is somehow implied symbolically in the chamber painting that it's associated with. The problem is that the poetry is so highly interpretive that it's impossible to know precisely what its theme is intended to be. Also, and I should have mentioned this before, but the grammar and syntax of their language is very different from ours in that they have no end to their language punctuated with periods. In other words, if we made a literal translation, there would be no sentence structure. More like a logic syntactical approach. Which simply means an abstracted language flow which would be, for most people, very difficult to understand. When I was doing the translations of the poetry, I placed it in a sentence structure that fragmented its meaning so that it could be better understood. Perhaps in the process I unintentionally changed the meaning, but it was either that or the poetry would be too abstracted to understand.
Is there a connection between the poetry and the philosophy of each chamber?
My colleague and I felt that all of the objects within a specific chamber were connected. Probably in ways we couldn't fathom. We were constantly worried that the translation indexes were somehow inaccurate, and that this was limiting our ability to see the linkages between the various objects. And of course the most puzzling connection was the technology artifacts, because we had no way to probe or reach any conclusions about their purpose or function.
Let's talk a little bit about the artifacts found in each chamber. The only one that I've really heard about was the one found in the 23rd chamber, the optical disc. I know you've shown me some photos of the others, but could you describe them better?
The optical disc is the only artifact of the 23rd we found that the ACO had successfully accessed, at least that I'm aware of. The other artifacts were all taken to the Labyrinth Group's research laboratory in Southern California immediately after they were discovered. These were never acknowledged to anyone below a security level 12 clearance. There were rumors within the broader ACO that there were technologies within the ancient Arrow site, but these never gained any serious consideration, and certainly not by the NSA. The technology artifacts were of the greatest curiosity to 15 because they represented possible solutions to BST. And, as I mentioned earlier, 15 and most of the Labyrinth Group for that matter, felt that the Wingmakers may not allow the Labyrinth Group to deploy BST. Hence, 15 considered the Wingmakers as possible foes, instead of allies.
But what I've seen doesn't look very advanced or based in high technology. They could pass for crystals or rocks. Or something organic. Why was the Labyrinth Group so intrigued by them?
The crystalline structures that were found, in most cases, did look quite ordinary in the sense that when they were examined by the eye, they appeared to be crystals, but when you looked at them through various molecular and atomic analyses, it was obvious that they were man-made objects. In other words, they were synthetic crystalline structures, and we held the hypothesis that they were encoded with information much like the optical disc or the paintings. We also held the hypothesis that they were potentially connected to the optical disc since it was the last of the artifacts and seemed the equivalent of a keystone or master key.
Did any of the text translated from the optical disc refer to the other artifacts?
No, to our disappointment, there were no references.
You didn't answer my question about whether you felt there was a connection between the technology artifacts and the specific cultural artifacts related to each chamber.
Sorry, I guess it's my turn to get sidetracked tonight. Anyway, yes, there were connections. We were certain of this, but at the same time, because we couldn't get inside the artifacts and probe them, we couldn't prove our theory. Consequently, we placed all of our time and energy on the optical disc because it seemed to be the most important of the artifacts as well as the one we had the best chance of accessing through our technology.
Why?
You must bear in mind that the technology artifacts were extremely alien to our technologies. Other than the optical disc, the other technologies were a combination of synthetic materials based on organic structures, and in some instances actually possessed human DNA within their structures. These were...
You're saying that the technologies were in part human?
Yes. In a way. But what I was going to say, is that these artifacts seemed to have molecular-based computer systems that activated by a specific human touch. And we weren't certain whether it was literally a specific human, or a specific type of human, or perhaps any human in a specific state of emotion or mind. We had 115 possible experiments developed for testing and all failed.
But this is real odd. Why would human DNA be inside a technology? And this talk about synthetic crystals. It leaves me cold.
We had some similar misgivings until we were able to translate some of the text within the optical disc. The philosophical papers from Chambers 1 and 2 convinced us that the Wingmakers could indeed be authentic and we had no other reason to disbelieve their story. That's not to say that we suspended all of our disbelief or caution, but the philosophy was a breakthrough to our understanding of their perceived mission with contemporary humankind.
I don't know. I read the first 2 philosophy papers you left for me, And I could believe that they're from an alien race. I could also believe that they're from a deceptive race that uses philosophy and all this cultural stuff to lull us into believing they're benevolent when in fact they're not at all. I mean, isn't that part of the prophecy you spoke about last night?
Well, I see you remain the ever-skeptical journalist. I'm actually glad to see that reaction. Sarah, all I can tell you is that when you take into account all of the cultural artifacts found within the ancient Arrow site, and you immerse yourself in their content and philosophy, it's hard to believe they originate from evil intent.
Unless that's exactly what they wanted you to believe.
Perhaps. It's hard to debate such a thing. I think at some point it's an individual decision. The Labyrinth Group, and I'm including the core team when I say that, was in agreement that it was an authentic disclosure from the Central race, and felt confident that we were not dealing with deception. But we never closed the door to that possibility. Our security and operations directors put contingency plans in place in the event evidence was accumulated that increased the probability of fraud or deception.